with Potomac Beads. Join me in creating this fun leopard bangle. It features two different sizes of crystals as well as your standard 15 and 11 seed bead. If you need any supplies or want to check out the different color varieties that you could make, check out the link below to shop with us online. Gather up your materials and let's get started. The leopard bangle is a series of tubular peyote with a little bit of netting mixed in. So we've already done tubular peyote on the gleam bracelet if you want to check that out as another bangle. And now we're going to do it again with a different pattern and a different design for this leopard bangle. I have 11 seed bead in the Duracoat galvanized gold, 15 O's in the matte black, and then I'm repeating a series of 3 crystal groupings. We're going to be using, per each little section of our bangle, 4 of our 4mm bicones and 8 of our 2mm bicones. Again, this is tubular peyote, but with a little bit of a twist. I have on the end of my thread, and you're going to need 10 plus feet of thread for this, I have a stop bead at the end of the thread. I'm going to begin with a series of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 11 seed beads. Let those 8 11 seed beads rest down toward your stop bead, and then we're going to sew back through the first 6 out of 8. Starting at the stop bead, I want you to sew through, taking your needle toward the end of the thread, the first 6. Make sure you're not missing any of these. The needle will come out then through beads number 6 and 7. After a nice tight pull, you'll realize that this is the smallest circumference that our bangle gets to every time we start over a new color. Coming out of bead number 6, we're going to change its name and call it bead number 1. So this is going to be bead number 1, and then we're going to go in and we're going to skip over bead number 2. We're going to add 1 11 seed bead and we're going to sew through bead number 3. We're circling and sewing in around. Coming out of bead number 3, add 1 more 11. Skip over bead number 4, which is your bead right next to that stop bead, and sew through bead number 5. Add another 11. Sew through bead, skip number 6, sew through bead number 7. From here, add 1 more bead because you're always going to be adding 4 beads in each row of this peyote stitch. Skip over bead number 8 and sew back into bead number 1. With your fingers, take those 4 beads that you just added and push them toward the top of the 8 beads. As you do so, I want you to do what's called a step up. In order to do our next row of our peyote stitch, you're going to sew through bead number 1 of that group of 4 beads that you just added and pull it up. As we get into the next row, you'll start to get more of that tubular shape. For our next row, we're going to begin with some of our bicones. We're going to put on 1 of our 2mm bicones, and I'm using the jet color first, and I'm going to sew through bead number 2 from that series of 4 that we just added. Pick up another bicone and sew through bead number 3. Pick up another bicone and sew through bead number 4. Pick up 1 more, because we do 4 in each rotation, and sew back through bead number 1 of your seed beads. Once you're back through bead number 1, give a tight pull, which should push the crystals toward the top. From here, once again, we're going to step up. Stepping up means going through the first bead of the row you just completed. So I'm stepping up through that first 2mm bead. With my thread now exiting through one of the crystals, we're going to begin a series of 3 beads for each of our 4 sides. 1 15, 1 11, 1 15. Sew through to the next bicone. This gets repeated 4 times the whole way around the piece as you add in these 3 beads 111 or 115, 111, 115 again. So through the next bicone. After each little section too, I do a little tiny pull to make sure that my thread is nice and tight. This is my third side, adding in those 3 beads, coming out of bead number 4 of the bicones. And as I add my last group of 3 beads, I sew back through bicone number 1. Now you can see how it sits a little bit open, almost like it's expanding outward for a circular peyote. We're going to bring it more into that tubular shape. And here's where we're going to do a tiny bit of netting. We're going to catch on to just those 4 corner gold beads as we progress to our next step up of our piece. So we're going to go through the first 15-0 and the 11-0 to step up. Now as we go around this piece, we are going to add in 4 of our 4mm beads. I want you to pick up 111, 1 4mm bicone, and 111. Sew into the next 11-0 in line. Add an 11, bicone, 11, sew into the next corner, 11 in line. It's going to end up looking kind of like a triangle of gold beads, and that's what we want. 11, bicone, 11, sew into the next corner. And you should see and watch the repetitiveness. Obviously, every time and every stitch that we step up, we are doing 4 of the exact same things. Going in and adding an 11-0, our crystal and our 11-0. Now what I want you to do is go back through that original 11, and we're going to step up like we just did with a little bit of netting into that first 11-0 that we added, and then up so we're coming out just the middle bead, which is our 4mm bicone. Once you're coming out the 4mm bicone, do a nice tight pull and bend your crystals kind of up toward the top. What's going to end up happening is the 2mm bead is going to look like it's sat a little bit recessed behind the 4mm bead. In between all our beads now, as we do another row of our peyote stitch, I want you to include 3 of your 11-0 seed beads and then sew through the next 4mm bicone. Obviously, you're going to repeat this a total of 4 times, adding 12 beads in all. 3 beads go on, sew through the next 4mm crystal. As you come back around then to your final piece, the 3 go on. Once again, we're going to go through bicone number 1, and then to step up just like we did, we're going to continue with that netting effect. You're stepping up through bead number 1 and bead number 2, coming out the central bead of that grouping of 3. Our next progression is always going to be catching that central bead on that group of 3. Once you have the central bead on that group of 3, I want you to add 15, followed by a 2mm bead, followed by a 15-0 seed bead. We're going to be downgrading now and creating the exact same effect on the opposite side of the 4mm. Going over to the next group of 3, grab just the center bead to pull that into a triangle, and make sure to give a tight pull to get the 2mm in there. This gets repeated as you continue with the bead, 4mm with a 15 on each side. Go over to the next group of 3 seed beads that you added between your 4s and pick up just that central bead. This is where it's pretty much peyote stitch, but with a netting twist. I actually did a Better Beater episode on whether or not netting is just a form of peyote. Going in here, there's my 3rd one. Going over, joining in to that middle bead. And then once again, one more time, in goes the 15, the 2, the 15, stepping back in to that central bead that your thread was first coming out of, stepping up then through the 15 and out the 2mm bead. At this point, I want you to give a nice tight pull on your thread, not your needle, because that will hurt the integrity of the thread that's currently in the eye of the needle. and give a nice tight pull, which is going to push those 2mm beads toward the interior and the 4mm bead toward the exterior of the piece. From here, it's very simple. We're going to add 4 11-0 seed beads between each one of our 2mm bicones. One gets added, the 2mm then goes right after you add another 11. You're going to add a total of 4 11-0 seed beads in between each one of just your 2mm bicone, so you're not catching on to the 15s at all. As you progress, you're going back through that first 2mm bicone, but you're also going to step up through that first 11-0 out of the 4 that we just added. Again, give a nice tight pull. From here, we're going to do 2 more rows of just 11-0 beads to finish off the rotation. 1 11-0 goes on, and you skip over to traditional peyote stitch, sewing onto and through the 11-0 that's already there. Pick up an 11, sew through the one that's already there. Now you'll notice you see a fair amount of thread right now. As I pull tighter to make this into more of that beaded bead shape, that thread will get eliminated. So at the end of each row, when you're getting things tighter, smaller, or bigger expanding, you just want to make sure that you're pushing all the thread toward the interior and then giving nice tight pulls to tighten up that beaded bead. From here, you're going to step up into that first 11-0 seed bead that you just added in that grouping of 4. From here, we're going to go through 1 more rotation of our 11-0 before we start over. So 1 more 11-0 goes on, which is going to be your series of 4 11-0 beads between each one of the pieces that are there. So a bead goes on, you're sewing through that 4mm bead. Oh, and I need 1 more bead out, of course, 1 short of my 11-0s as we add in our 11-0. So back through bead number 1 and progress up through bead number 1 of the row you just added. Give a nice tight pull, and that finishes our beaded bead. Now all we have to do is start over many, many, many times over. So it's up to you what you want the pattern to be, whether or not you want to progress to a chunk of the black ones and then the brown. I have the jet, the smoky topaz, and the metallic bronze iris that I'll rotate between. After coming out here, you're just starting over again. So I'm going to start with my smoky topaz and go right back in. All you need to do now is watch this video on repeat. You can also slow it down if you want to in the settings right below me on your YouTube station. You're going in, you're repeating, repeating, and repeating as you add in and make this bangle longer. As you progress with your piece, you're going to notice that every time you do one of your beaded bead sections, it sits lined up with the next, meaning that there's just 1 11-0 seed bead between each set of your bead. I'm going to continue making mine longer here, adding on my beaded bead sections, and then we'll get ready to attach it and roll it into our bangle as we progress and get further and further into the design. Adding in our rotation here of our jet, then our smoky topaz, then our metallic bronze, and repeating. When you have to add thread onto your project, I suggest doing it in the middle sections between your little beaded beads. You're going to take new thread, burn it off your spool, and I only like to work with 5 feet of thread at a time. That is me personally. I don't like when my thread gets tangled. Having the thread on there, I'm in between my rows of my singular 11-0 seed bead of peyote stitch, and I'm going to tie my new thread onto my old thread. Pull that other side and get it as close as you can to the bead. I'm going to keep my thread and needle on the project and sew through, tying my thread ends together. So I'm knotting the 2 threads together, but I'm keeping my needle on for a reason. I have 2 good knots in there. Now my thread end that's currently connected to my needle, I'm going to sew back into the peyote stitch design. What that's going to do is separate this thread end from the knot. So I'm just going to go through the next bead after it, and I'm progressing downward instead of going up. Once I have that separated out a little bit, I'll pull it tight over that direction. Take my thread burner, burn down, making sure you're not burning the thread that's already there. Put a new thread, or a new needle on the new piece of thread. Sew through that last peyote stitch one more time, and then progress on with design. After I have it progressed on a couple times, I'll go back and I'll burn off this thread edge as well. Now I'm ready to go and continue on adding my beaded bead sections to my leopard bangle. The last step in the process to your bangle, and you'll have upwards, I have a series of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of my pattern, and I have a fairly small wrist. You need to keep in mind that it needs to go around the widest part of your wrist. Something also to keep in mind is it has a little bit of a stretch to it. So if it fits around your wrist, chances are it's going to stretch a little bit. If it's not stretched around your wrist, to fit over that hump in your arm right there. So what we're going to do is we are going to seam the two sides of our peyote stitch together. I lucked out that the fit is perfect for mine, and I'm looking back to the starting row of peyote. I'm coming out and I've added my 11 seed beads in between each one of my bicones. I'm going to go to the alternate side, lay out my bracelet flat, lay it out on my bead mat here, and line it up so that way I can sew the two pieces of peyote stitch together in a nice seamless line. To do so, I'm going to take my needle from the side that I'm currently working on, go over to the other side, and instead of adding a bead onto my peyote stitch, I'm going to sew through one of the beads that's already there from the previous side. So see one of those fours sticking out on top? I'm going to sew through one of those 4 beads. That pulls in my next bead for my peyote stitch. To add the next bead on that, I'm going to sew back over to side number 2, because I'm currently on side number 1. Let me get that started thread out of the way so you can see. And I'm going to go into my next seed bead. So basically I'm continuing with that peyote stitch, but I'm not adding any beads. I'm grabbing the bead from the other side. And I'm going to go back over to the next one, up through that 11-0, back over to the first side, or sorry, the second side, the end side, through the next 11-0. And I'm not pulling tight because I want you to be able to see that thread line as I'm doing it. You can see it zigzagging between, but you may want to pull tight from both sides. Keeping tight also that starter thread because I did take off the stop bead. From here, I'm back through bead number 1 there. And you can see how it's just becoming a nice seamless line as I go back and forth. You can spin the bangle around to bring it to the back of the design. Go through the bead there. And we're just continuing along that peyote stitch. Once I stitch and combine myself to all the different sides here, sewing through all 8 beads, you can see how it really is completely flawless there. As I do so then, I'm going to, right where my thread ends are together, knot my thread ends. I'm knotting them together 1, knotting them together 2. Now what I'm going to do is take my thread from side number 2, or my ending side there with the bronze, and I'm going to sew it back into side number 1. Likewise, I'll take a needle and put it on my thread edge that was coming out from my starter side, and I'll sew in toward the bronze. As you sew, you may need to rotate your bangle, just rotating from one side to the other and kind of spinning it around as you progress along the design. This connection point here, because it is flawless and seamless, adds a beautiful look to the design. Once I'm back through a little bit, I'll knot off the thread by going underneath one of the bridge threads and tying some knots and burning down my thread. A couple more stitches with the side my needle is on, and then my needle goes on to my starter thread, and I sew back a little bit further to do the other side to complete my beautiful leopard bangle. Thanks so much for joining me and having fun making your leopard bangle. Remember, if you do want to do one of the leopard bangles, please share the colors and the supplies that you use in our Facebook group for beading and jewelry making. I can't wait to see all the different varieties of colors that come out of this design. As always, if you do need any materials, the bicones or even the seed beads, check out the links below to shop with us online at PotomacBeads.com as well as PotomacBeads.eu. As always, too, give a little thumbs up if you like this video and comment below with suggestions, questions, or ideas for the further beading community. As always, thanks so much for watching and enjoy your new leopard bangle, which I hope you'll make in a creative, exotic amount of colors.